I, as one informed about these matters, and having also some experience, know very well that at this time, as far as one can judge from the works that have been published, no one can be found who can be compared, both in intellectual power and in mathematics, with this master Kepler, let alone be preferred to him, so that I have no doubt whatever that when it is brought to the attention of His Majesty most graciously and most humbly, he will not let him go for any amount of money. Bavarian Chancellor Hans Georg Herwart von Hohenberg, to His Most Imperial Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II. After the divine goodness had given us in Tycho Brahe so careful an observer, that from his observations the error of calculation amounting to 8 minutes betrayed itself, it is seemingly that we recognize and utilize in thankful manner this good deed of God's. That is, we should take the pains to search out at last the true form of the heavenly motions. Johannes Kepler. My goal is to show that the heavenly machine is not of kind of divine living being, but similar to a clockwork, insofar as almost all the manifold motions are taken care of by one single, absolutely simple magnetic bodily force, as in a clockwork all motion is taken care of by a simple weight. And indeed, I also show how this physical representation can be presented by calculation and geometrically. Johannes Kepler. Hello, and welcome to the Scientific Odyssey. The Scientific Odyssey is a many-part journey into the history and philosophy of science. My name is Chad Davies, and I'm the writer, host, and producer of the podcast, where we consider the ideas, processes, and results of over 2,500 years of scientific inquiry and discovery. Series 3, Finding Our Place. Episode 19.3, Supplemental. Johannes Kepler, Triumph and Tragedy. As we reach the most productive and consequential period of Kepler's amazingly productive and consequential life, the decade or so he spent in Prague as the imperial mathematician to the Holy Roman Emperor, it behooves us to address a couple of matters before we dive into his life and work during this time. The first has to do with the manner of Tycho's death. As was mentioned in our episode on the Taconic model, the standard historical narrative regarding Tycho's passing is that he died from sepsis due to a ruptured or perforated bladder following an evening of heavy drinking. There are, however, a certain number of historians and writers that have called this account into question. The primary reason for this is that there are many medical professionals that say that it's impossible for a human being to voluntarily restrain the urge to urinate to the point where the bladder would rupture. As such, it is unlikely, they claim, that this was really the cause of Tycho's death. So with this in mind, a number of other hypotheses have sprung up regarding the cause. Most of these center around mercury poisoning as being the real culprit of Tycho's passing. While we really haven't discussed it much, In addition to being what might be thought of as the first truly scientific astronomer, Tycho was also fairly heavily involved in alchemy, again, in a fairly scientific way. In this work, he would have had access to fairly significant amounts of various heavy metals, including that most intriguing of substances, mercury. In my researches on Tycho's life, I found that the most common alternative death hypothesis focuses in on an overdose of the metal as the direct cause of the death, and then they go on to speculate about how that overdose might have occurred. The three possibilities I found were the following. One is accidental ingestion by a man who was overworked and exhausted by Rudolf II's constant demands on his time. The second is intentional ingestion as a form of suicide, as a way to escape a life more and more consumed by Rudolf's incessant need for astrological and political advice. And finally, ingestion as a form of poisoning from a party seeking to get Tycho out of the way. Versions of this last hypothesis have been put forward that have the originating party of this, poisoning is either being the Danish king Christian IV, who sought to remove his one-time vassal from the world stage and keep him from influencing the policy of the Holy Roman Empire, which of course was a chief rival to Denmark's political ambitions in Europe, or our man Johannes Kepler, who, in a fit of rage, poisoned Tycho to finally get at the data and free himself from the servitude he saw himself as being in. Now, all of these ideas have been given their time in the spotlight, and a goodly amount of speculation has been offered as to their veracity, but none have been found to be supportable. Tycho's body has been exhumed on at least 2 different occasions, and tissue samples have been analyzed, which show no massive spike in mercury dosage. While it does seem that Tycho is suffering in some sense from mercury exposure, the level of exposure wasn't above what would be expected for a man in his line of research. Additionally, there's no real evidence that it was either suicidal or that Kepler was truly murderous beyond the imagination of some writers looking to sell books. None of our best sources offer any other explanation other than the one put forth in the traditional narrative. In the latest exhumation, medical examination of the body supported this idea that the perforated bladder was the cause of death. Whether the cause of that perforation was excessive drinking or some other factor, such as a secondary infection, is harder to pin down, but it seems clear that Tycho's death was not related to some ill intent. Hence, Kepler, as sometimes is claimed, it did not murder Tycho. The second thing I'd like to talk about has to do with Tycho's data. One of the parts of the narrative is that when Tycho died, Kepler more or less steals his data and then refuses to give it back to the members of Brahe's family to whom it belonged. While there is some kernel of truth in this, it's a good bit more complicated than that story where the jealous Kepler absconded with Tycho's notebooks in the most historically fortuitous case of intellectual theft we know of. So here's how it really goes. When Tycho died, the Emperor Rudolf II, who had paid for Tycho's move and all of the new observational facilities Tycho had been using, laid claim to all of the instruments and data. Now, when it was pointed out to the Emperor that most of those instruments and data were actually things that had been developed while Tycho was in Denmark, he agreed to purchase it all for a fairly generous sum, and the various people in Tycho's family were pretty happy with that. The amount of money, by the way, was about 100 years worth of Kepler's actual salary as the district mathematician at Graz. Upon this promise, Kepler came into the possession of the data he'd been waiting for nearly 2 years. Unfortunately, as was usually the case with Rudolf II, just because he made a monetary promise, that didn't mean that the wheels of bureaucracy in the court immediately jumped to meeting the obligation. Rudolf was famous for writing checks his treasury either couldn't or wouldn't cover. When the payment for the materials was tardy, Tycho's family came looking to repossess it all. One of the arguments they used was that Kepler hadn't actually done much with the data in his time with it, and so maybe there was someone better suited to the job of preserving and forwarding Tycho's legacy. Tycho sorted things out by making one of Tycho's assistants, who had married into his family, that man named Tyndall, the overseer of the project, and thus took the data away from Kepler. Kepler, knowing that Tyndall was a better politician than he was a mathematician, gave over all the data except that data pertaining to the planet Mars, which he had been working with just prior to Tycho's death, and which he correctly thought held the key to making progress towards developing an accurate model of the solar system and producing the promised Rudolphine tables. In time, however, Tyndall discovered Kepler's subterfuge and demanded the rest of the data, which Kepler then duly turned over. However, it didn't take Tyndall long to realize that he wasn't going to make much progress, and so he and Kepler worked out an arrangement to share the data so long as Tycho's family got to review any work that was derived from it prior to publication in order to see that it honored the great man's contributions appropriately. Finally, we should discuss the efforts of Tycho's family to get the data. In the usual narrative, Tycho's heirs are represented as a bunch of sort of bumbling amateurs and meddlers more concerned about their own reputations and legacies than Tycho's. The two key figures in this, at least initially, are Tycho's oldest son and the aforementioned Tyndall. While these two men were nowhere near as talented as either Tycho or Kepler, I think the historical judgment of them has been a bit unfair. The way I see it is that all of this stuff was Tycho's intellectual property, and when he died, in absence of a will stating otherwise, it should have gone to them, just like land would have. Both men had been groomed by Tycho to take over his scientific enterprise when he died, and so it was pretty natural for them to think that they had a claim to his instruments and data. As we know from what Galileo was doing with his military compass at this very time, there was a good bit of money to be made simply by constructing instruments and then training others to use them. Rudolph's offer to buy the property was a fair deal, but when he didn't follow through on his end, it's understandable, I think, that they wanted all that stuff back. Tyndall was a serviceable astronomer, and it is conceivable that he could have run the observatory outside of Prague reasonably well, I think, though it has to be said, it's much more questionable that he would have ever made any progress with the data he collected. He just wasn't that good a mathematician. All of this is to say that maybe we shouldn't be as hard on the Tycho family as the historical narrative often is. In fact, what we'll find out in our next episode of the podcast is that one of Tycho's younger sons will be tremendously helpful to Kepler in getting the data and the information put out there in a way that both honors his father and allows Kepler access to everything he needs. For our purposes in this episode, though, the upshot is that Kepler, with some interruptions, now has access to Tycho's treasure trove of data. The question is, what will he do with it? Prague suited Kepler well. As the biographer Max Casper notes, it may be the one place wherein Kepler can reach his full potential as an astronomer and mathematician. It is this cosmopolitan crossroads, and de facto capital of Europe, at least at this time, where Kepler has everything he will need to be successful. He's well enough supported that while not rich, his needs are reasonably well met, and he really wants for nothing. For about a decade, because of the emphasis by Rudolf II on attracting scholars and academics and poets and artists, the specter of religious conflict and persecution are far from Kepler's doorstep, and so he's at peace and can practice his faith. Additionally, he is surrounded by other talented and educated men with whom he can interact in a way free from censure, and thus his intellectual curiosity is continually stoked and fed. In fact, his position as imperial mathematician offers him some protection from the pressures to publish and allows him significant independence from both the scholastic and Philippist academic traditions, something I think Galileo would have given a lot to have. In short, at age 28 and just entering the prime of his intellectual life, Kepler's in something of a sweet spot, and what he will be able to produce there is truly remarkable. His family life, however, is not so perfect. His wife, Barbara, seems to have suffered from depression and a nearly overwhelming fear of poverty. In a sense, she had been a country girl who had made good in the area near Graz. She had married a man who she probably realized too late she didn't really understand, both figuratively and literally, as Kepler kept the practice of speaking Latin when discussing religion with guests in their home, a language Barbara didn't understand as she only spoke German. As religious tensions began to tear apart Graz and then Greater Styria, she struggled to keep any sort of equilibrium. When the small family moved to Prague, she found the city overwhelming and stunningly expensive. Scarred by the brush with poverty they had experienced during their last days in Graz, Barbara seems to have retreated into herself and her fear of not having enough, and so denied herself some of the things she and her husband could clearly have afforded. The tension between the two of them was ever present, something Kepler didn't help in sometimes losing his temper and speaking harshly to his wife. While things never deteriorated to the point they had between his father and mother, the marriage was far from Kepler's hope of emulating Jacob and Rachel. After Tycho's death, Kepler, with the benefit of his newly acquired imperial salary, moved out of the mansion Tycho had kept his entire household in to a small, simply run home in a part of Prague known as Newtown across the river from the imperial complex. Shortly after moving there, Barbara gave birth to a daughter named Susanna, a joy for the family as they began to settle into life in busy Prague. Kepler's professional life during this time was a rousing success. Prague loved and admired its mathematician, and Kepler carried on a number of friendships both personally and by correspondence. The emperor followed his work closely, and his home was a regular stopping-off point for visiting dignitaries. In a way, his role in Prague was much like it had been in Graz, but in a much bigger pond, so to speak. He was expected to produce calendars and cast horoscopes of various sorts, something he was growing weary of. During this time, his attitudes towards astrology seemed to have become significantly more skeptical, with much of his advice now being based on unbiased observation of events rather than prognostication based on the positions of the stars and planets in the heavens. Beyond this, he was occasionally asked to weigh in on scientific and technological matters, which caught the court's interest from across Europe. It would be in this way that he would be asked to evaluate Galileo's telescope in 1610. In 1602, just as Kepler was really getting into his work, Nagel returned to Prague and demanded Tycho's data on the grounds that the family hadn't received payment for it and that Kepler didn't seem to have done much with it to produce the tables Tycho and he had promised the emperor. While Kepler certainly would have disputed this claim, as he had been making significant progress in applying the data initially to his polyhedral and harmonic models and then just very recently to some really new and innovative thinking, he recognized that he needed to produce something soon. In response, he promised to publish a work on optics by the end of that year and a new theory on the orbit of Mars a year after that. Unfortunately, both promises were overly optimistic. The book on optics was a continuation of the work he had begun in Graz in 1600 while attempting to work out the details of a more permanent move to Prague just before being banished because he refused to convert to Catholicism. He had been attempting to tackle a couple of questions Tycho had come up with about viewing eclipses with a camera obscura. His idea was just to sort of finish that up, this kind of the answers to those questions, publish them with a dedication to the emperor, and then get everyone off his back. Instead, of course, his curious mind sort of dug into the problem and found a whole bunch of different but related issues he felt he needed to look into. The biggest of these was developing a full picture of how the eye worked. Prior to his investigations, it was thought that the fluid in the eye created the image that was then somehow observed. Kepler was able to show that the convex lens at the front of the eye refracted the light coming into it so that it formed an inverted image on the back of the eye at the retina. As part of this, he developed a new way of representing light that is still used in physics classrooms today, the light ray and associated light ray diagram. He was then able to extend this work to develop a complete theory on how all lenses work, specifically those used in spectacles. For those of you who, like me, wear eyeglasses, you can give thanks to Kepler for working out the math of just how to grind them to make them effective. Additionally, he was able to develop a model for the brightness of a light source as a function of the observer's distance from that source. Known as an inverse square law, Kepler correctly deduced that when a source emits light, it does so in all directions. As the light travels out, it must pass through an increasingly large series of imaginary spheres. In a way, sort of think of a set of imaginary clear balls, say the first one being the size of a golf ball, and the next one a softball, and the next one a soccer ball, and those in increasing order. While all of the light coming from the source has to pass through each sphere, the amount of light per unit area will decrease as the total area of each sphere increases. Since the area of the ball goes as the square of the radius of the ball, the amount of light per unit area, therefore, goes as the inverse of the square of the radius of the ball. Therefore, if you, as an observer, are standing 10 feet from a candle and move to a position 20 feet from the candle, only a quarter of the previous amount of light will pass through the pupils of your eyes, and thus the candle will look to be 1/4 as bright. The book that would be published in January of 1604 under the title Astronomiae Pars Optica was an immediate success. When Galileo's telescopic observations were made in 1609 and reached Kepler in 1610, and there were questions regarding how the instrument produced magnified images of things far away, Kepler was able to apply the principles of this work to show that telescopes did not alter the light in any way other than redirecting it to form an image, and thus what was being seen was as real as anything that the eye would produce. This second work, titled Dioptrice, would, together with Astronomiae Pars Optica, form the basis for all 17th century optics and would be used by both Newton and Huygens when they expanded that field. It was during this work that Technical would discover that Kepler had withheld the Mars data and thus demanded its return, only to soon realize that he had about as much chance of producing the Rudolphine tables without Kepler as he did collecting the sum of what the imperial court owed him for Tycho's instruments. Hence, the two entered into an arrangement that we discussed earlier. Well behind schedule, but seeing that things were heading in the right direction, Kepler promised the publication of a second work in 1605 under a new title, appropriately Astronomia Nova, or the New Astronomy. Events, however, would conspire to delay the publication again. First, Kepler moved from his small house to a new residence in Winslow College in order to be closer to other scholars. Additionally, he and Barbara welcomed another child into the world, a son. More than anything, though, it was the appearance of the 1604 nova that delayed things. As discussed in the Starry Messenger episode, astronomers all over Europe rushed to make good observations of this event. Tycho may have been the only person to make observations of the 1572 nova that were of high accuracy, but now, 32 years later, his methodologies were well enough known that many observers sought to determine if the now dead master astronomer's conclusions applied to this new object. Among these, of course, were both Galileo and Kepler, both of whom had access to excellent instrumentation, though for very different reasons. Kepler would work with the University of Prague's rector and astronomer Martin Bakacek to make good observations that showed no parallax with the new star over a lengthy period of time, beginning on October 17th. Even though these observations took Kepler away from his work of calculating the various positions of Mars using his model and then comparing them with Tycho's observations, he was eventually able to publish a book on the observation of the nova and what it might mean both physically and astrologically. There's a humorous quip in the work wherein Kepler makes an argument against the star spontaneously assembling via some sort of a combination of atoms, that theory more recently gaining credence among scholars. In the story, he compares such an event to the spontaneous assemblage of a salad, wherein the leaves of lettuce and slices of eggs and the ingredients for a dressing were to come flying together in the presence of a pewter dish and thus create a salad and the container which held it from nothing. He then goes on to mention that he had told this to his wife, who replied to him, quote, "Yes, but not as nice as this one of mine," end quote. The work on Astronomia Nova was enormously frustrating for Kepler, even as he managed to make great progress on his other projects. In a very real way, this was the work that he had been originally given by Tycho, and he was struggling to get a match between any known model and what Tycho had observed. He had thrown out Tycho's model fairly early for a variety of reasons, not the least of which was that he thought it was rather hodgepodge. Importantly, though, he understood that the model had done away with the spherical structures of the heavens. He was hoping to confirm his own model, but he initially had a lot of trouble in doing that. So what is the heart of the problem with this? Well, it has to do with the fact that a planet, as it moves through the sky, doesn't move at a constant rate through the stars, even when things like retrograde motion are taken into account. This sort of motion is hard to account for, and it can't be made to happen in a model consisting of purely circular orbits centered around a single central point, i.e., the Earth and Ptolemaic models or the Sun and Copernican ones. The first adjustment everyone made was to shift the central object, either the Earth or the Sun, off of the center of the circle to a point known as the eccentric. This had the effect of creating observed differences in speed. In other words, it caused the spacing between the Earth and the planet to change, which gave the perception of the closer thing going faster. To give an example first put forward by Katie Ferguson in her book, think of a bird flying overhead close to you, while an airplane does the same at an elevation of 30,000 feet. The plane is moving at around 500 miles per hour, while the bird might only be going about 20 miles an hour, but the bird looks like it's going a lot faster because it's closer. The problem with this is that it doesn't account for all of the difference that you actually observe when looking at the motion of objects in the heavens. So Ptolemy, to solve that problem, introduced his despised equant idea, wherein the planet moved in its path as if it were moving at a constant speed when viewed from a point on the other side of the Earth from the eccentric. Copernicus, of course, hated this, and as we've mentioned in our episode on the revolution of the spheres, getting rid of it may have been the primary reason he shifted to a heliocentric model. He introduced an epicycle to his otherwise sun-centered circular orbits to make up for that removal of the equant. However, this model didn't work any better than Ptolemy's, though it should be noted that this is an estimation rooted in as much in hindsight and as it is in the observations of the time. Neither model could predict certain astronomical events such as eclipses with great accuracy, a case of which was what started Tycho off on his quest for better measurement techniques. But it was also true that prior to Tycho's Herculean effort, there just weren't any really good data to be able to tell which model was better. The errors in the observations, the few that there actually were just too great to be able to constrain the models and figure out which one worked better. Kepler's hope was that with better measurements, better parameters could be calculated for each of the models that would bring one of them into agreement with the measurements and the problem would be solved. He hoped that it would be his polyhedral and harmonic version of Copernicus's model, and so that's what he started with. It turns out that his working specifically with the Mars data was extremely fortuitous, as not only did Mars's observational parameters deviate most from what a purely circular orbit would predict, but also, in his attempt to measure Mars's parallax, Tycho had gathered the greatest amount of data on Mars, data Kepler would actually extend using Tycho's methods a little later on. What Tycho started with was a pretty straightforward approach of using previous methods, and he soon hit upon the realization that the center of the circle upon which Mars moved wasn't halfway between the Sun and an equant point. It was actually a little closer to the equant. But then he found that if he actually went with that approach, other data wouldn't fit the model that he was looking for. Then he hit on an important idea. If all the centers of the planetary orbits were offset from the Sun, and not exactly between the Sun and an equant point, why wasn't he doing the same thing with the Earth's orbit? What made the Earth special? With that, Kepler in the book therein asks his readers to look at what was going on with the Earth, and he was able to show a very, very important outcome. The Earth's motion around the sun had to be speeding up as it got closer to the sun and slowing down as it got further away, even if the orbit was simply an offset circle. Such a leap of insight was due to the work Kepler had done in the Mysterium Cosmographicum a decade earlier, wherein he posited that the sun provided some driving force that impelled the planets along in their paths, and that this driving force depended on the distance from the sun. Closer to the sun meant the force was stronger, further away meaning a weaker force. Still holding to this idea, Kepler recognized that if this force idea was correct, the Earth and every other planet should speed up in their orbits as they got closer to the sun in these offset circles. And it is here that we see another revolutionary step where just one thing has changed, and as a result, everything has changed. That one little difference, that one little idea, would open all kinds of doors for Kepler. Yet, there were also a couple of caveats to be made, so as not to get carried away with our enthusiasm for Kepler's leap. First, we shouldn't think that Kepler has in mind some sort of proto-Newtonian set of ideas here that would include a centrally directed gravitational force. Kepler's still pretty Aristotelian in his physics, and he doesn't have any idea of the concept of inertia Galileo is developing at roughly the same time just a few hundred miles to the southwest. For Kepler, the idea was to extend Aristotelian terrestrial physics outward into the celestial realms by saying that an impressed force was required to keep the planets moving. Now, while I haven't specifically run across this anywhere in Kepler's writings, many commentators say it would seem that he may well have been influenced by a specific work published in 1600 that seems to really have changed his thinking about his force hypothesis in those years between 1595 when he published the Cosmographicum and 1605 when he finally finished the work for the Astronomiae Nova. In that year 1600, William Gilbert, one-time physician to Queen Elizabeth, had published what was a truly seminal work on electricity and magnetism titled De Magnete. And specifically, the thing he talks about in that work is the Earth's magnetic field, though he doesn't really use the term field at the time. What he shows is this field is able to exert forces on objects, such as compass needles, across an intervening space in a regular and predictable pattern. Hence, such a force, or at least something very much like it, was a good candidate for Kepler's idea that the sun would also produce a swirling force around it that would propel the planets in their paths. With this mechanism in place, Kepler was able to dispense with the epicycles as there was no central object in an epicycle that would propel this motion. And so for him, this was the death of the Ptolemaic system. He also did away with the Tychonic system once and for all, since all of the rest of the planets were to move around the sun due to this force, so why would the Earth be any different? His focus on the causes of motion, even though they would ultimately be shown to be incorrect, would be the thing that would create for him a path of reasoning that would lead to the correct description of the motions of the planets through space. The second thing to understand is that when Kepler developed a mathematical model for the motion and then tried to use it for circles, it didn't work. His method for determining this was pretty clever and based on something Archimedes had done in antiquity. What the ancient Greek physicist had done was shown that one way to estimate the area of a circle from any point within the circle was to divide the circle into wedges with sort of the tip of the triangle being at the point you were standing. Each wedge could be approximated by a triangle with a base that was almost a match for that particular arc of the circle that you were looking at and the side that was the distance from the circle to where you were standing. These two measurements could then be used to calculate the area of each wedge, and those areas could be added together to get the full area of the circle, or at least something close to it. The thinner you made your wedges, the closer you got to the real area. Kepler had the idea that he could use a similar approach if one did the calculation standing on the sun, as it were, and then having that speed of the planet would be the thing that created the area of the wedge, say, over 2 weeks of the planet's motion. Now, what Kepler says that the area over that 2 weeks is going to be the same whether the planet's closer to or further away from the sun. In other words, An imaginary line connecting the planet to the sun would sweep out equal areas in equal times. When he tried this for the Earth on a circular offset orbit, it worked within the observational errors of Tycho's measurements. However, when he tried it for Mars in the same way, it failed by 8 minutes of arc. This meant that either his equal areas idea was wrong or his circular motion idea was wrong. Interestingly, such was his respect for Tycho and Tycho's methods, Kepler rejected the possibility that the measurements were wrong, a profound moment in the history of science. As Kepler would write, quote, "These 8 minutes showed the way to a renovation of the whole of astronomy." End quote. So Kepler decided to ditch the circular orbit, as the history of astronomical modeling was littered with failed circles. His first inclination was to work with a geometrical figure known as an ellipse, but he was skeptical that that could be the correct answer. If it were, he wrote to a friend, then surely someone such as Archimedes or Apollonius would have discovered this idea in antiquity. This questioning may have led him to make a mathematical error that would bedevil him for a couple of years, and it sent him down the wrong road to considering other orbital shapes until finally, working with a circle combined with an epicycle, he realized his error. He wrote, quote, "I was almost driven to madness considering and calculating this matter. I could not find out why the planet would rather go on an elliptical orbit. As if I were roused from a dream and saw a new light," end quote, he saw the answer. The orbit was an ellipse, but it was halfway between the circle that he had started working with and the circle in the epicycle he had moved to working with. Moreover, the sun had to be at a specific point of the ellipse known as a focus. This would become known as his first law of planetary motion and could be stated as all planets move in elliptical orbits around the sun with the sun at one focus. The equal areas relationship would therefore become known as his second law. This was a huge triumph. Kepler could now describe with amazing accuracy the orbits of all of the planets in a modified Copernican system, something I teach my students to call the elliptical heliocentric model in order to distinguish it from Copernicus's completely circular model. Astronomia Nova was finished in 1605, and in its 58 chapters, it doesn't just state Kepler's ideas, but rather takes the readers on an intellectual journey that Kepler himself had traveled to get to those ideas, beginning with the well-established astronomical ideas he would demolish, and slowly and inexorably unraveling and disposing of them to be replaced by his new concepts in mathematics. It's a truly brilliant work that would bring him great fame among the learned community of astronomers, even if they didn't always want to accept his conclusions. Such was the case for Tingnagel, who was not pleased when presented with the work for approval. He had hoped to see Kepler confirm Tycho's model rather than come up with a variation on Copernicus's artifice. To resolve the conflict, Kepler agreed to allow Tingnagel to write a preface to the work, and so it is like Copernicus's revolution in that Kepler's Astronomia begins with a disclaimer. The printing of the book would take another 3 years, as everything that had to happen had to go through Rudolph. But in 1609, it finally saw the light of day, introduction and all. And as remarkable as this work is, so too is the trajectory its author had followed. He had risen from a family mired in such poverty that it had considered selling his brother into indentured servitude to cover its expenses, through the path of scholarship schooling to become a local school teacher and mathematician. This would have been remarkable enough given the barriers to social promotion in place throughout Europe at the time, but then fortune had carried him, even as something of a beggar, from Graz to work with the greatest astronomer of all of the world, and then to the position of imperial mathematician. And now, finally, he was the most celebrated figure in the academic world, if only until Galileo published The Starry Messenger. It is a truly astonishing testament to the ability of both hard work and a gifted intellect to overcome dire circumstances. And yet, even in acknowledging this, Kepler's escape from those circumstances dictated by his family's plight would not have been possible without the scholarships he received to study at first the district Latin school, then in the seminaries, and finally at the University of Tübingen. Scholarships made possible by the grants of the Duke of Württemberg and the court there. Without these programs designed to identify and promote those with demonstrated talent and a willingness to work hard, Kepler would never have left the small town life he had been confined to by birth and circumstance. Even as he reached this pinnacle of professional success, things were beginning to spiral out of control in the world around him once again. While his stepdaughter Regina had married into a wealthy and prestigious family, his wife continued her descent into depression. Further and further she drifted from the environment of Prague, homesick, frequently ill, and deeply unhappy. Things were no better for Kepler's benefactor, the ill-fated Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II. Affected himself with some mental illness, Rudolf had been both an ineffective ruler in Bohemia and in the empire as a whole. He was indecisive and prone to melancholy. Moreover, he resisted the forces of the Counter-Reformation, taking a live-and-let-live approach to allowing both Lutherans and Catholics a certain freedom of worship and conscience within his lands. While this was tremendously helpful for Kepler and any number of other people, and profoundly contributed to that atmosphere in Prague of intellectual openness, this was unacceptable to his relatives in the strongly Catholic Habsburg family. As Rudolf's indecision slowly transformed into paralysis, and he became a recluse, the family met in 1606 and named his brother Matthias to be the new head of the clan. 2 years later, Matthias gathered an army and invaded his brother's territory, marching to within a day of Prague. Seeing the writing on the wall, Rudolf abdicated his position as Holy Roman Emperor and was stripped of most of his titles save those of Bohemia and Silesia. He also named Matthias his heir. As the Astronomia was being published, the forces of the Counter-Reformation were once again flexing their muscles in the Habsburg-controlled territories of Germany. Still, though, in Prague, things remained calm. In 1610, a copy of Galileo's Sidereus Nuncius, or the Starry Messenger, reached the emperor, who loaned it to Kepler, who had already heard the news from a friend in the court. He was asked by Rudolf to render a judgment on the work and the discoveries its author purported to have made. Kepler, not yet possessing a telescope, wrote a defense of the work, claiming that such observations were reasonable and that the telescope was in fact a reliable instrument. In time, Kepler would acquire access to an instrument and would independently confirm Galileo's observations, as well as develop that full optical theory related to how the telescope worked. As part of this, Kepler worked up all the ways two lenses could be combined to magnify images, thus coming up with a superior design for a refracting telescope than the one Galileo was using. Unfortunately for history, Galileo and Kepler did not strike up a collegial relationship on the basis of this work. Kepler was mildly critical of some of Galileo's ideas in a couple of his works, and Galileo, embroiled in controversy with the scholastic natural philosophers of Italy, didn't take kindly to what he saw as additional criticism. Had the two been able to establish an academic dialogue, Kepler might have been able to learn about inertia, and Galileo would have had a chance to see that his adherence to circular motions, as described by Copernicus, was an error. In 1611, Kepler produced, as a gift to a friend in the court of Rudolf, a lovely little work on the formation of snowflakes that was both whimsical and also a pioneering piece of scholarship in what would become the science of crystallography. Its tone, however, was in stark contrast to the machinations within the court that were plotting to restore the former emperor's fortunes. In early 1612, Rudolf allied with the Archduke Leopold V to bring an army to Prague to evict Matthias's troops. This army, however, was unpaid and undisciplined, and so they ravaged the countryside, looting and pillaging throughout the lean months of winter. As is often the case with such misadventures, the soldiers brought with them disease, both something called at the time the Hungarian fever and smallpox. The latter killed Kepler's oldest son, Frederick, who had been born just after the Keplers had moved to the Wenzel College house there in Prague. The tragedy struck both parents especially hard. Soon, though, the troops were in Prague itself, and fighting broke out between bands of Protestants pledged to protect their parts of the city from looting. As a part of this, the Protestant bands took to looting and desecrating Catholic churches and institutions within the areas they controlled, setting the stage for years of conflict to come. Kepler had seen some of this coming, and in 1611 had begun seeking a way out of Prague if it became necessary to flee. He had high hopes that with his newfound celebrity and recognition, the Duchy of Württemberg would offer him a position either in the court or at one of the universities there. However, it was at this point that his generous ecumenism came back to haunt him. At a point earlier in his life, Kepler had proclaimed that he considered a follower of Calvin a brother in Christ, even if he didn't agree with that person on all points of doctrine. Now, with positions, doctrine, and theologies hardening, this admission was considered heretical, and he was not only denied an opportunity in his home province, but soon he would end up excommunicated from the Lutheran fellowship entirely. It was a personally crushing turn of events. Nevertheless, he had to find a place of safety for his family, and so he accepted a position in Linz, a place still within the Holy Roman Empire, thus allowing him to retain the position of imperial mathematician while getting him away from the fighting. In April of 1612, he traveled to Linz to make the arrangements, but when he returned in June, he found his wife seriously ill. Matthias's troops had reestablished their authority in Prague, but in doing so had brought with them more disease. Barbara, despite her struggles with depression, had been tending to the afflicted when she too came down with the illness. On July 3rd, it would carry her off. A portrait of Kepler from this time shows him a shell of a man, shattered, haggard, hollowed out. His shoulders slump, and there are bags under sad, tired eyes. Still, though, he would remain at the court of Prague, offering advice and service until Rudolf was finally deposed once and for all. Only then did he take the remnants of his family and travel to Linz, hoping to escape the strife that had disrupted his work once again. Unfortunately, his hope was not to be realized, as success and tribulation would be interwoven throughout the remainder of his life. Next week, we'll conclude our exploration of the life of Johannes Kepler. Before we go, however, I would like to make a couple of additional observations regarding the work we've discussed in this episode. First, when Kepler was confronted with the failure of circular motion to account for his law of equal areas, he was really being confronted with a huge decision. He had spent the last 10 years of his life building models based on circles, just like everyone before him had done. These models had built into them the ancient Platonic idea that circles were ideal. This was a bias that had made its way deeply into both Islamic and Christian scientific thought throughout the Middle Ages, and with the revival of harmonious thinking after 1500, there were many reasons Kepler could have given as to why it should have been preferred to stay with that sort of approach. And yet, even with all of his personal investment in the idea, he ended up rejecting it in favor of Tycho's measurements. I think that too often, commentators neglect to recognize what a truly important thing this is. For millennia, reason had been held to be the more accurate way of understanding reality. Now yes, Aquinas had shown that experience had a role in guiding reason, but up until this point, philosophers had guided inquiry, not scientists. And yes, I know that term, scientists, really isn't an accurate term for this period of time we're discussing, but we're going to go with it. With Kepler, we have one of the first instances where data is held in higher esteem than reason. It's a truly important step that will help define the burgeoning scientific revolution that is taking place at the dawn of the 17th century. Second, I don't think that this would have been possible had not Tycho taken the data he did. Tycho's data gathering had been meticulous in its pursuit of precision. Yet more than just that, Tycho was able to show that there was some uncertainty in his measurement, and was able to quantify that uncertainty. As Max Casper points out in his biography of Kepler, what Kepler receives from the great astronomer is accurate enough to exclude all other models but his own, but not so accurate as to get him bogged down in certain inconsistencies that would have arisen were the measurements even more precise. Had this not been the case, his explanation of physical causes would likely have failed, and he wouldn't have been able to create a reason to reject those circular ideas. And this third thing, I think, is worth pointing out. Kepler needed causes for the motions of the planets. He had to go beyond the saving the appearances sort of approach that had characterized much of astronomy up to this point. He was unafraid to bring physics and astronomy back together again, even in the face of some opposition from the natural philosophers who felt physics was their thing and that astronomers should keep out of it. Faithful listener Andrew Mintz rightly asks why it is that it took so long to figure out that ellipses were the correct figure for the description of the motions of the planets in their orbits. As we mentioned, Kepler himself seems to ask the same question once he decides to reject circles. Conic sections, of which an ellipse is one example, have been known at least as far back as Apollonius. Why didn't somebody else try these sorts of figures before Kepler came along? I think the 3 points I've just made go a long way to answering that question. First, there was the Platonic bias towards circles, and getting past that required more than just a hunch that maybe something else might work. Second, until Tycho, there wasn't accurate enough data to show that circles couldn't be the right answer. Third, there had to be a reason to think that the planets would speed up and slow down in their orbits around the sun. Kepler is unique in being willing to embrace all 3 of these things in his pursuit of that true answer. I'd like to say thanks to Andrew for his question, and say also, if you'd like to join the conversation regarding the topics we discuss on the show, I would encourage you to either like our Facebook page, follow me on Twitter @ChadDavies, or visit our website, thescientificodyssey.typepad.com. Also, if you haven't done so, please subscribe to the show on whatever service you listen to your podcasts on. That way, you can be sure to get the latest content delivered seamlessly to you. And finally, if you're enjoying what we're putting out there, why not recommend the show to a friend? We're always looking for new folks to join the crew of the Odyssey, and I'm guessing you know someone who's keen for new horizons. So why not send them a link to the show on that service that you're using and invite them to give us a listen? They'll thank you, and so will we. As we close, a big thanks to the Blue Dot Sessions for allowing us to use their music as part of the show. Be sure to check them out at www.sessions.blue. Until next time, full sails on your journey.